Founder fans, Jason here, and today's founder is Patrick Henry. Now, we're not just going to talk about any Patrick Henry today, we're going to talk about a young Patrick Henry and the case that kind of brought him to prominence on the eve of the American Revolution. Before we do that, we have to take a step back and talk about tobacco. You see, there was a little bit of a bad harvest in the late 1750s during the French and Indian War that caused several issues. Notably, though, because there was a shortage of the crop, the costs went up, the price inflated. Now, this hurt local farmers because now they had less crop to sell and had to sell it at a higher price. But it certainly helped the clergy. And the reason for this is the clergy at the time were paid in pounds of tobacco. Now, because the price of tobacco tripled, so too, essentially, did the salaries of clergy members. Now, to rectify this situation, Virginia's colonial assembly, known as the House of Burgesses, decided to pass the Two Pennies Act. And this essentially started paying clergy members in cash instead of tobacco, at the rate of 2 pennies for every pound of tobacco they should have gotten. The reason they did this is because that would have paid them more or less the same salary they had already been receiving. It should not have been a problem. However, once word of this got to England and the eyes of the king, King George III decided to veto this. He wanted to keep things the way they were. Now, it took several years of going back and forth before the veto finally went through. This is where Patrick Henry comes into play, because eventually there is a Reverend James Murray who sues Virginia for the back pay he was owed. He said, hey, you've been paying me in cash at 2 pennies. You should have been paying me at 6 pennies this whole time per pound. I'd like that money, please. And this goes to court. And a young Virginian lawyer who not a lot of people knew about named Patrick Henry shows up to argue against paying this James Murray what he was owed. Interesting side note, the judge who oversaw this was actually John Henry, Colonel John Henry, father of Patrick Henry. Now, what's very interesting is after the arguments go through, of course, they had to pay this man something. The king had already declared what the law was. So it wasn't as if Patrick Henry could get zero amounts of money going to the reverend who was suing Virginia. But what instead happened is this reverend was awarded 1 penny. That's right, the equivalent of what they wanted to pay him for half a pound of tobacco. It was an embarrassment to the reverend who was suing. It was a slap in the face of the king, essentially, and it prevented any future clergy members from also trying to sue. Because by this point, it was 1763. The French and Indian War had ended. Shortly after this, you'd be getting currency acts and stamp acts and a whole slew of intolerable acts. But what's notable is James Murray wrote to a friend after this, more or less accusing Patrick Henry of treason. Now, while we don't have any specific transcripts of what Henry said during this, what became known as the Parson's cause, we do have reflections from other people, including James Murray, which essentially said, if any king who overturns a law made by the representative of the people is a king that's on his way to tyranny. Now, this is not necessarily exactly what he said in court, but this is the impression the people in the court got. And again, this 1 penny that was awarded by a jury. So this is Patrick Henry, first of all, becoming a man of the people, speaking out against the king's decisions, and refining his oratory, which would later make him known as the man who said, 12 years later, give me liberty or give me death. Again, I just want to reiterate that he's speaking out against the king before the Stamp Act and before the Intolerable Acts. He's already started leading a little bit of an angry crowd, if you will. And he would, of course, go on to be a major revolutionary, a future multi-term governor of Virginia, and the Patrick Henry we know and love today. But a lot of people are not super aware of what he was as a young man and how he came to prominence, because this certainly made him a little bit well known in colonial Virginia. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Hope you learned about Patrick Henry and the Parson's cause. If you did, give me a big like down below. I would really appreciate that. Make sure you subscribe for videos about the American Revolution 5 days a week.